Hello, middies. Say hello, middies.
Hello, Middies.
All right, so this is the week of what is it? May 11th. Lessons. Last week we finished like the counterculture, all the '60s stuff. We introduced the Watergate with the assignment. This week we're gonna start going into like 1970s, Cold War. Really start winding it down. We'll be done with it by next week. So kind of get into really the meat potatoes, the last little bit of the Cold War. We'll basically finally be done with this. So as I said, you see by the PowerPoint here, by the slide, 1970s, Cold War, that'll be our focus for this week. You will have an assignment that I will go over a little bit, or just a little bit later. Kind of explain that. Alright, so objectives. What I want you guys to get out of today's or this week's lessons is really having the ability to compare and contrast the two different eras of the Cold War. You have the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Obviously, as we talked about, very chaotic. Bay of Pigs, Berlin Wall, Berlin Airlift, Cuban Missile Crisis, the Red Scare. Very, very hectic, very chaotic, very, tensions were very high. And then we start kind of winding down into the 70s and 80s where things are kind of starting to kind of go down the roller coaster, where things are kind of starting to calm down a little bit. So that's what you'll kind of notice throughout the next week and a half to 2 weeks as we kind of finish this up. What were some of the major events that happened here at home during the 70s? Sure, not just Cold War stuff, just things in general, current event things that happened during the 70s and 80s, and then finally wrapping up the end of the war really next week. All right, so kind of talking about that first. Going back to Richard Nixon, you guys had an assignment about him with Watergate that I had you guys work on in the last week's lessons. Now again, just some bullet points that kind of wanted you guys to kind of get out of this. Nixon, when he won in 1968, the election, he's in a campaign on bringing the troops home in Vietnam. And so, kind of a double-edged sword. He will eventually live up to that promise, but keep in mind that you had the Kent State shootings that happened that was under his watch. So, again, a very kind of chaotic time in that late 60s, early 70s range. And Nixon campaigned on like bringing law, bringing order, respect for law. And that's kind of where, you had like the countercultural movement, and student movement really wasn't really a big fan of Richard Nixon because of that whole kind of clash of generations and ideals. So Nixon brings troops back home, and as you guys did in the assignment, his legacy will be marred by Watergate. Nixon was kind of seen as a maverick in terms of politics. As you guys saw, really he was known as kind of towing the line, or in some cases going above the line in terms of cheating or getting an advantage. You guys did a little bit of reading about that and how even in his campaign in 1968, he was even accused a little bit of kind of some unethical things. So the Watergate scandal, as you guys read about, it was this group that was created to find individuals, to find Democrats, basically, to spy on the opponents of Nixon to create an advantage in the election for him. So finding leaks in government and sabotage Democrats in the 1972 election, that's basically what Watergate was. You okay, Chase?
I swallowed.
Do you choke?
Yeah.
Are you alright now, bud?
No,
Do you go get some water then? You tell mommy? Alright, sorry guys. Alright, so anyway, so in Watergate, the burglars got caught and they were breaking into the Democratic headquarters. And Richard Nixon is a Republican. So you see in that election, there was obviously if Richard Nixon knows and is covering up by trying to break into the Democrats' headquarters, trying to gain dirt, wiretap, which is what they were doing, wiretapping phones, to try to gain some advantages for talking points and to talk about in the next election. So Nixon basically tried to cover up the scandal, claimed he didn't know anything about it. He refused to cooperate with the investigation. He proclaimed executive privilege when the judicial system tried to subpoena the tapes that were recording in the White House. Nixon said that they didn't have the right to do that. He didn't have to hand over the tapes. because it was executive privilege. Eventually, he will end up turning over the tapes, but he will resign from office. He would have gotten impeached if he would have, stayed in office, but kind of sparing himself, sparing the party. He chooses to resign. You good, bud? All right. Sorry, guys. All right. So a couple other things that happened was the big energy crisis. So you have to keep in mind, guys, the baby boom, 40s, 50s. Well, guess what? All these baby boomers now who are now 16, 17, 18, or in their 20s, they're all driving. So now if all of a sudden, if in the 1950s, if you're used to 30 million drivers, all of a sudden in 1970, 1980, you're now having 80, 90 million drivers, you just double. That's basically what the baby boom was. That the population will basically double. Babies are born all the time in the 40s and 50s. Now all those kids now are able to drive. So if they're able to drive now, that means there's more car on the road. If there's more car on the road, that means they need more gas. So the problem was that we were so dependent, and it was kind of a rude awakening for us. We were so dependent on the Middle East for oil. We weren't self-reliant. We needed the Middle East for these things. So there were a couple of events that happened in the 70s. There was a war going on in the Middle East with Arabic nations versus Israel. And we supported Israel. So basically what ended up happening is that a lot of these Arabic nations were seen as the enemy, the supporters of the Israeli government. So these Arabian nations who have all the oil, they have a monopoly. They all choose to kind of formulate an alliance where they say, hey, we have all of the power, we have all the oil. So they created this organization called OPEC, O-P-E-C. You see it right here in the slide. So they decided to cut off the United States from oil. Gas prices start to soar, rise. My grandparents were alive in the 70s, my parents, they were saying that at this time, you were basically, they had to ration gas. You were only given a certain amount of gas, very similar like World War II or World War I. You were rationed gas during that time. Gas prices were so high, or even in some cases, gas stations would run out of gas, and you wouldn't be able to get any. So some changes had to be made. This really started with Nixon, and it eventually built off into other presidents in the 70s and 80s, but lower the speed limits, saves gas. Conserve energy. Start to drill for oil in Alaska and in the Gulf. Start creating nuclear energy. So we see the nuclear power plants. We actually have one in Perry, Ohio, up near Menor, Ashtabula area. So that will be the other forms of energy that we're going to start to investigate and invest in to gain more self-reliance on gas, so we can kind of get away from the Middle East and not be so reliant on them. But you see this sign here, sorry, no gas. Again, very common. All right, so Richard Nixon, when he steps down, when he resigns, President Ford will become president. Very unpopular president because he's going to see his very close ties to Nixon. Ford was the vice president under Nixon, and a few things. Richard Nixon should have received some trouble for what he did. He should have received more of a punishment. Gerald Ford is going to pardon him. What pardon means that basically Richard Nixon won't receive any type of formal punishments. So when that happens, Ford's ratings is going to go down. He will also pardon the Vietnam draft dodgers, which will be seen as very unpopular as well among some Americans. So you see this poster down here. Again, Nixon will become very unpopular because Ford was tied to him. Some things that Ford did, he will also become unpopular too. All right, so it's just some fashion things that happened in the 70s. You know, this is like my parents' era. You see these in movies like, That 70s Show or whatever. You've seen examples of this. Austin Powers, if you've seen that. But the polyester was very, very, very big back in the 70s. You see some of the fashion here. You just kind of see the Brady Bunch, that kind of thing. Bright colors, the butterfly floral patterns, the tight pants, what kind of flares at the bottom, the platform shoes, as you guys see here, bell bottoms were very, very popular back in the 70s. Music and movies. Also, the idea of technology also got better and better during this era too. So you had the first sci-fi movies were developed in the 70s, and it's also kind of the Cold War era. So a lot of Cold War-ish type of movies came out: sci-fi, space race, space exploration. So you have the Godfather, the Mafia movies became popular as well. Star Wars came out, obviously a huge franchise. Jaws in the late 70s, early 80s. Grease came out. Alien, Rocky movies with the Cold War, Exorcist with the, kind of a horror movie. So they kind of had those themes intertwined in the movie industry. And then obviously you have music. This is where Michael Jackson became big, but in the 70s he was a kid. He was not even in his teens yet. The Jackson 5. It was him and his brothers. So I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. And just the Bee Gees were a very big disco band that was around during this time. All right, so really quick, going into the Cold War things that happened in the 70s. As I said, overall, the 70s was relatively peaceful between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It was way different from the 50s and 60s. You have Nixon, Ford, and Carter were the presidents in the 70s. Jimmy Carter's actually still alive. He's in his 90s now. But the real idea with Nixon became the idea of realpolitik. Vocabulary term, you know it, but realpolitik means common sense politics. Although you hate Soviet Union, although you might hate communist nations, especially China, China's communist, you might want to do what's in your best countries, in your best interest. So an example of that, Nixon met with China to improve relations. Why? China was communist, we didn't like communism, but it was in our best interest to work with China. Why? Because they had 1 billion people. That's 1 billion consumers could buy U.S. products. If we get along with China, they buy U.S. products. It helps our businesses out. So that's the idea of realpolitik policy. Saudi Arabia, same thing. They have their King Abdallah. Not a very good guy. Did a lot of bad things, but it's in our best interest to have a relationship with a Middle Eastern country to gain an ally, where a lot of people don't like us. So that's kind of what it means by realpolitik. So under this, in the 70s, the big idea was a term called SALT. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty that Nixon and the rest of the Cold War presidents are going to sign. Nixon met the Soviets to agree to decrease the nuclear weapons, not increase, decrease. Again, it's in our best interest to start decreasing nuclear weapons, become more of a peaceful country. Now Nixon's going to sign this with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. So Brezhnev is the president in the 70s in the Soviet Union. Did you guys see this picture? Actually, no, that's China. Never mind. Anyway. Now, you guys will see one of your assignments for today is going to be, or in the ed puzzles, will be the Iran hostage crisis. I highly recommend, if you guys have time, watch the movie Argo. I would have showed that in class, but unfortunately we're not going to be meeting. But if you have Netflix or something that you're going to be able to see, Argo, A-R-G-O, it's excellent, and it showcases what the Iran hostage crisis is and the story behind it. But ultimately, long story short, in 1979, Iran militants are going to storm the U.S. embassy in Iran. They're going to hold over 60 Americans hostage for about a year. And there's a history behind it. You guys see here the why. Why did they do that? It all stemmed back from the 50s. The United States and the CIA overthrew Iran's leader, the Shah, and placed Mohammad Reza Pahlavi into power. And this guy was not very good for the Iranian people. He increased the debt. Not very good in terms of rights for their people. Killed a lot of people. So finally in the 70s, there became like a revolution started happening where they're going to overthrow him and place the Ayatollah Khomeini into power. The Iranian people wanted to hold Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in contempt and hold him in court and charge him for crimes against humanity. He comes to the United States, he gets cancer treatment, and we refuse to give him back to Iran. And that's what basically started the whole process. And then finally, you guys see here, the Soviets are going to invade Afghanistan. Guys, this will basically be the Soviet version of Vietnam. The Soviets will be bogged down in Afghanistan, and ultimately, this is what's going to cause like the end of the line for the Soviets. Although they could say they're going to win, quote unquote, this is going to drag them into a decades-long war, drain their economy, put them into severe debt, and ultimately, this will be the end of the road for the Soviet Union as we get to next week. Alright, so anyway, that is it for today. I'll post some things to Google Classroom for you guys. I have a couple videos, kind of cool, like some BGs and some different things you guys can kind of watch and view at your own leisure, kind of see some of the fashion and music and that kind of thing. And the Jackson 5 as well. So view that. But anyway, that's it for the lecture. Adios, have a good week. See you next week.